Multiway solving has been our most requested feature. You asked and we delivered. Multiway solving has finally arrived. That means you can solve custom three-way post-flop spots with full controls over all the variables. We've been working towards this for a long time, and we're thrilled to finally share it with you. Alongside that, we've seriously upgraded node locking with a redesigned interface and a smarter frequency locking algorithm. Here's how you can use these features to dominate the tables. I'm going to present two new features in this video. First of all, multi-way solving. So custom three-way post-flop solutions can now be solved for any set of ranges, stack sizes, bet sizes you want. It's completely customizable. And the first thing you'll notice when you look at one of these is that nobody's playing like this, which leads to some really profitable opportunities for the studied players because it gives them a big edge on the rest of the field. We'll also introduce Node Locking 2.0, which comes with a better interface that's easier to use, as well as smarter frequency locking. So now when you tell the solver, I'd like this player to bet, for example, half the time, it's going to find the least exploitable way to do that. Okay, so how are we going to show off these features? Well, I think the best way is to solve a real hand history. And I've got one here played by Rampage Poker that I thought was really fun that we could dive into. As a coach, when I choose which hand to analyze, I need to consider many different factors, including how close they play to GTO. Does it match our pre-flop solutions? Is it a cash game, an MTT? Was it three ways to a flop? Is there good live footage, etc., etc.? And then somebody sent me this video, and I threw all of that out because I was just so tilted watching this hand that I had to immediately analyze it. And I knew as soon as I sent it to me that this is going to be the hand. So this was played by none other than Rampage Poker, and I'm calling it the bluff call. Just an absolutely insane hand played in a 10-20 game. So he's seven-handed, 10-20. They're infinite deep at 400 big blinds effective. Under the gun opens to 60 or 3 big blinds. By the way, guys, I'm going to show you the footage, but just to give you a quick recap. So under the gun opens to 3 big blinds, hijack calls. Rampage is in the button, and he calls with king jack suited, small blind overcalls. So it's 4 ways to a flop. On the flop, we have jack 9-3, and hijack bets big, which is kind of weird for multi-way, but he's 200 into 260. Hijack calls, Rampage calls on the button, small blind folds. Turn pairs the jack. Under the gun, again, betting really big. Overbets the pot, gets called by both players. And then the river, under the gun, shows no signs of slowing down. They bet 3K into 4K, 150 big blinds. Hijack shoves for 20,000. Action on Rampage, and he's got trips, right? He's got king jack here. He puts in his stack with middling trips, and then under the gun, tank folds with better trips, and hijack shows the bluff of 8-9. Rampage scoops a $22,000 pot, and somehow nobody has a boat. Just an absolutely ridiculous hand. I'm going to take you through the footage, and we're going to go through the solve step by step. I'm going to show you how we can solve multi-way in GTO Wizard, as well as how we can kind of adjust what the players are doing using the new node locking interface. Let's dive in.
So about 10 to 15 minutes into this 10-20 game, we pick up king jack of clubs on the button when we're playing seven-handed. There's an undergun open to 60. Hijack makes the call, and on to me. I think we can go either way with a 3-bet or call, and considering that we're just getting settled into this big game, especially here in Vegas, I make the call, and the small blind calls as well.
Let's dive into this analysis. So the first thing you need to do is find the right solution. Here's what I came across. So they're playing 7 max, which means I'm going to choose 8 max and just shift under the gun forward 1 position. They're playing super deep, 400 big blinds. I'm going to choose 300. There's not going to be a huge difference between playing 300 or 400 big blinds effective. At some point, deep stacked is just deep stacked. I'm going to choose chip EV for the rake structure. And I don't think they're actually playing timed rake. I'm choosing this because a no rake solution causes the GTO players to defend wider, which I think is actually going to match what's happening in game. I think they're overcalling much wider than a raked game would have them do so, and so this is an exploitative adjustment. Finally, we select the opening size and the strategy. I'm going to choose general. So under the gun opens 3x, and as you can see, it's very, very tight, only 13% of hands. Hijack cold calls with this range. And again, this is much tighter than I think he's actually defending. In game, he had 9-8, which you can see is just not a call here, but we can alter that later. And here, Rampage decides to call King Jack on the button, a perfectly fine call, although I will nitpick that his reason for calling, quote unquote, I just sat down, is not a particularly compelling reason to choose calling over raising. Small blind also came along, but in this case, I only want 3 ways to a solve because this is a 3-way solver, and frankly, small blind didn't contribute anything anyway. So what we're going to do now is select fold, fold, and we're going to take a flop with AI. Here you can see I've customized this a bit. So first of all, I've changed the stacks here. They're all super deep stacked. So I've entered the actual stack sizes, size of the pot, and I've entered some custom bet sizes here on flop, turn, and river. Note that I'm using fixed bet sizes, and I've actually just typed in like the exact sizes that were used in game. This is just going to make the analysis a little bit easier. So you can do this with the tree editor, for example, call, and then bam, bam, bam. I've got it all mapped out here. Now, one thing we could do is we could widen like Hijack's cold calling range. Rampage even said in game that he thinks like Hijack is calling pretty suspect here, but we're not going to do that for now. For now, I'm just going to leave it as is, and then we're going to do an exploitative analysis afterwards.
So 4 ways the flop becomes Jack 9-3 rainbow. Pretty good flop for King Jack, I would say. And the under the gun player puts in a continuation bet, and it's a sizable one to $200. The hijack now makes the call, and I've seen him call a bunch with a bunch of suspect holdings, so he doesn't have to be too strong. But our hand with top pair and a good kicker, I'm definitely not folding, but I'm a little bit suspicious of this under the gun player's bet as it's really large. Anyways, I call as well, and we're going 3 ways to a turn.
Let's examine that flop decision. So under the gun immediately bets out for 80%. This is a huge c-bet in a multi-way pot, and as you can see, the solver just checks everything. 100% of their range is checking here. It doesn't want to bet, and part of the reason is that you're out of position against 2 players. And secondly, those 2 players are supposed to be rather tight. Like you can see, like a hand like ace-ace only has like 67% equity. Plus, you can expect a lot of money to go in if you check. Now, that said, they decided to bet big, and Rampage immediately flags this as a little bit suspect. It's like setting off some alarm bells, like why are they betting so big? There's not a whole lot of hands in their range that would like actually want to bet big here. You can see like the red hands lose a ton of EV betting big. The only hands that really make sense to bet big are like over pairs, maybe king queen is a bluff. There's not a ton of hands that like want this size in your range. So, okay, they bet huge. Hijack calls, and they're calling really tight. You can see only about a third of the time they're calling. And action on the button, the first surprising thing is just how often you're supposed to raise in position. And it feels a bit weird here because, like, why would you want to squeeze that much? You have position on both players. Part of the reason is that you're super deep, but part of it's also that you want to kind of squeeze out all that, like, really strong drawing equity from both ranges. You're just not going to realize a whole lot of equity. And your range is weaker than it looks here. Like a hand like King Jack, we can see that King Jack of clubs is actually raising more than it's calling. It's not folding, but it's definitely raising a lot. And that's not for value. That's a bluff. Like if I change this to equity, we can see King Jack only has 35% equity. So we're already behind somehow, right? And that's something that people like are not getting right with multi-way, is that it's just way tighter than you think it is, especially with cold callers. All right, so Rampage calls, small blind folds, and we'll take a turn.
The turn comes a jack. Oh boy. Trips with a good kicker, and even better, the under the gun player bets out 1,000. Now, I don't really know how well and comfortable I'm feeling with this spot where this player is betting with a really strong range and is going to be betting huge into multiple players, overbetting the size of this pot, and then we see the hijack player call as well. What the hell is happening? It's really hard to fold this strong of a hand, but with all of this interest, it starts to creep in my mind just a little bit. But anyways, I'm just going to come along and call as well. We're going to see a river, and we have a massive pot building already.
The turn pairs the jack, and this is a pretty miserable card for under the gun's range. We can see their equities drop dramatically, And a good reason for this is that now a lot of your straight draws are just like dominated by boats, and a lot of your overpairs are now dominated by trips. So pretty miserable card, and Under the Gun should slow down here, but they decide to keep betting. This time they overbet the pot, and we can see that GTO Wizard's already getting angry here, like, this is a low frequency line, what are we doing? But we're gonna push forward. The hijack calls here, and you can see that they're cold calling with boats, like nines, jack, jack. In fact, about 34% of their calling range is a boat. The other 47% is trips. So they're very rarely calling with anything worse than trips. Maybe ace nine very specifically. And you can tell, like, this is probably way tighter than they're being in game, but maybe this goes to show that multi-way solutions in equilibrium are far tighter than people are in game, and that represents an opportunity to profit. They call, and at this point, King Jack is already supposed to fold, so yeah, Rampage. Here he starts to sense, oh, maybe my hand's not good. I'm starting to get worried with these big bets and these overcalls. So he's already thinking, my hand might be in trouble, but it's too strong to fold. But the solver has the opposite, or a much nittier line of thought. It thought it was behind even on the flop bet, and facing the turn, it's like, this is a slam dunk fold. The only hands that are really continuing, like ace jack is mixed, and then we've got like some slow played boats in here. What's crazy is like even threes is mixed, and I don't think people find a fold with threes here. For sure not. Okay, so we call and take a river.
The river comes a completely inconsequential card, a 4. The first player to act, unknown player, again, is going to bet all 3 streets. And for really large sizings, he bets $3,000 with like 5,000 behind. And the hijack, I didn't mention, he covers the entire table, has like maybe 20, 25,000 in stack. And he announces 2 ridiculous words, and that's all in. Oh God, we have about $7,500 in our stack. And wow, this is pretty miserable, isn't it? We are essentially losing to only pocket nines and ace jack. So this hijack jam seems like it's really nutted or nothing. And it seems really hard for him to have ace jack or pocket nines because we obviously have a jack. Can I really put him on only ace jack? Can this other player have queen jack, jack 10? Worst jacks here? For sure. And I think I can put pocket threes out of the equation because I think that hand is going to raise a lot on the flop or turn. So I'm mainly just praying this hijack player has a bluff, and maybe this onion player has an overpair, or maybe he can just fold something. I don't know, but I just think about it for a while, and it's the first hand in this really large game. I make the crying call. And now, after we committed our stack, the unleague player puts in a long, long tank. He says he's in a miserable spot, and while he's thinking his options over, he actually flashes his cards to the table, and oh my God, it is ace jack of hearts. Oh no. Oh no. We're so screwed. Looks like we're going to have to reload because we are just going to ship our stack his direction. But ultimately, he thinks, and no freaking way, we don't have to reload. He folds. He freaking folds. And somehow, the hijack player announces he only has a 9. And just like that, we show King Jack, the second best hand, and we ship this massive $22,000, $23,000 pot our way. We bluff called out the best hand and somehow win a massive one. Are we a genius, or do we really just suck at this game? And I think I'm just really, really bad. So lucky to have this hand go our direction, but this was crazy. What a roller coaster of a hand, and to see ace jack thrown into the muck, couldn't tell you how good that feels.
All right, so here, finally, Under the Gun puts in another meaty bet with ace jack. So they've got trips, they're pushing their equity. Again, the solver just wants to check this hand. It thinks, okay, ace jack is not actually even a value bet. In fact, your hand is 2% equity. So, like, what are you doing? Like, why do you want to bluff? Which is crazy to think about. Like, why is top trips a bluff here? I don't understand what's going on. Almost certainly Under the Gun is value betting in real life, right? And again, I want to just take a moment to point out the absolute ridiculousness of this GTO solution and show you that in practice, people are way wider than Nash equilibrium in multi-way pots. So under the gun shoves here, and realistically, the only hand that's like really makes sense to shove is like jacks or nines. Even like bottom boat is not really good here. In game, they shoved with 9-8 for a bluff here, but that's like insanely loose. It's sometimes turning ace-jack into a bluff in this spot. So they shove, and actions on Rampage. He's got king-jack, which we can see is no longer a call. So king-jack is just, it was folded before. And even here, like, nines is folding, because like if you have nines, then hijack has jacks, so you're already behind. And perhaps someone even has jack nine, like if you widen the ranges, threes is folding. So, but he calls with king jack, and he calls this a bluff call, because then what happens is under the gun folds ace jack. So they fold the best hand. And like somehow Rampage scoops this pot. Absolutely incredible. Okay, clearly that last one was extremely nitty, and players are much wider in practice. So let's perform an exploitative analysis. The first thing I'm going to do is widen these ranges. Right? These are too tight. I think in reality, players were much wider. Now, the easiest way to widen the ranges is to just use this slider here. But I'm going to do something a little more sophisticated. I'm going to go back to the preflop solutions, and I'm going to do two things. First of all, I'm going to lower the size. Secondly, I'm going to choose a later formation. So instead of under the gun hijack button, I'll choose hijack cutoff button, for example. Okay, and so now my plan is that hijack's range will replace under the gun, cutoff will replace middle position, and button is still button. But this has the effect of widening all three ranges, but in a way that's kind of GTO. So this is just my own style. You can, of course, tweak the ranges however you want. But I think under the gun in a live game probably opens something closer to this. It probably opens twos in full, right? So this is maybe closer to like a real under the gun range. Middle position, who called 9-8, and who Rampage actually has like a read on that this player is too wide, we're going to represent them with this one. So I'm going to go plug this in. I'm going to make a few minor changes to this. So I'm going to have them call a little bit with these lower pairs. I don't think most players are finding very many of these traps with like pocket pairs or ace king or ace queen. We're going to go ahead and just like widen all of this. Maybe even wider is fine. Something like this. Okay, so this is kind of wide. And one trick here, if you hover over any hand and just scroll with your mouse wheel, you can see it goes up and down. All right, so you can kind of like fine tune it a little bit this way. Anyway, this is the range I'm going to assign them. Yeah, something like that looks good. It's a lot wider based on his read. And lastly, we're going to pick button. Now, we already know that I plan to call this hand in full, which probably means he does this hand as well, and probably these. Now, I'm just going to stipulate here that I don't actually watch many poker vlogs, so I have no idea how Rampage actually plays. Please don't take this to mean like this is my read on his range. This, to me, is just like a demonstration of how one might go about node locking. I don't really have any particular read on how these guys are playing. Okay, so yeah, this is the range I'm going to plug in for Rampage. Rampage, please don't be offended. Did not mean to assume your strategy. But yeah, anyway, we'll take these. They're much wider. The next thing we're going to do is we'll create the solution, and I'm going to show you how to node lock to adjust the strategic tendencies a little bit. So here, the first thing we note is that they're still checking basically everything, right? But in reality, we saw that they were betting ace-jack. Okay, so one way to force them to bet more often is with the new node locking tool. Here I have range frequency, which lets me set the action frequencies for the entire range, and hand frequency, which lets me fine-tune it for individual hands. So I'm going to use range frequency, and I'm going to set the betting frequency to 60%. I think just based on their betting pattern, this player c-bets aggressively. I don't think they really had any notion of like slowing down, so they probably just bet quite a lot, despite the fact that they're out of position to 2 players and that Jack 9-3 is not great for their range. So what this does is, now that I've set the global frequency to 60%, is it's finding the least exploitable way to bet 60% of the time. So given this constraint that you're forcing me to bet this often, what's the best way I can achieve that, given that both of my opponents are going to fight back? And it's this. So this is part of the new like intelligent frequency locking we've implemented, but we've also updated the interface. So you can see node locking looks completely different from how it did even a couple weeks ago. Another cool feature they added is this show initial strategy. So if I go here, this is the initial strategy, and this is the current strategy. I can also use reset back and forward to kind of iterate back and forth. I can lock and unlock. We noticed before that a lot of players, after they would change the range frequency, they would forget to lock. So we've got this guy. This switch is like an auto lock. So if it's on, the range is just auto locked. If it's off, only the hands you manually tweaked that have a lock symbol on them will be locked. Anyway, I'm just going to leave it on. Just easier to not make a mistake that way. Now you might be thinking, okay, this is kind of cool, but how can I set it manually? Well, that's where hand frequency comes in. So I can still manually paint this strategy a bit. So for example, let's say I think that ace jack, king jack, queen jack, these hands always bet. I can manually paint over them as well. Or maybe I think that certain combinations of ace king always bet. I can do that as well. Lastly, down here, you'll see a little arrow. I've got 2 options. I can either lock previous nodes or resolve entire street. So lock previous nodes, what it does is if there are previous nodes on the street, it will keep those the same, whereas resolve will allow them to update. In this case, we're acting first, so it doesn't matter. Okay, I'll click apply. Bam. And remember, what we've done is we've forced under the gun to bet more often. Okay, action on the hijack, and we've got this range here. Let's go ahead and tweak this a little bit because we have the read that hijack is kind of a calling station. So the first thing I'm going to do is change the range frequency. They're calling 22% of the time. Let's go ahead and bump that up to, let's say, 30% of the time. All right, so here's their new calling range. So they're calling 30% of the time, raising a little bit. Action over to Rampage. And here you can see that it's squeezing like everything. So everything that continues through a squeeze. And there's 2 reasons for this. First of all is that the expected value of calling is just not, like, there's not a lot of like hands that strictly prefer calling in range, because it's just really hard to like realize your equity with most of your middling range against both of these strong players for this huge size. And secondly, because we forced like a lot of these other middling like drawish hands into both ranges, button is now very incentivized to squeeze and push out one of these players. And we'll notice again, the king jack is not a great hand here. So I go down to equity, like it's got a little more equity this time, but king jack is still like, it's got less than 50%. So it's not doing great. Now, I don't think that Rampage was actually like raising everything that continues. I think he's probably just doing a lot of calling. So let's go ahead and change calling from 1% to, let's say, 25%. Okay, very nice. Actually, I'm going to make one minor change here. I think that hand like jack-jack very often traps. Oh, I don't want to flex folds there. I want it to go half call, half raise, like that. Okay, and the reason is that, like, again, I think top set is a pretty natural slow play in the sense that if you raise, like, you block a bunch of the hands that call you, namely top pair. And at the same time on this board, it doesn't feel particularly vulnerable. So I'm kind of inclined to like overcall with top set here. Okay, but otherwise, I think this seems like a pretty reasonable range. We could maybe argue, like, is Rampage really going to find overcalls with these pairs? I doubt it. Yeah, maybe he finds like some calls with like ace queen. I don't know. Ace 10 or 10-10. Yeah. Okay, so this looks pretty good. Another thing we can do is we can select hand classes. And we can, let's say, take a look at top pair. And I don't think he's ever folding jack 10 at all, right? So I'm just going to change that to like a pure call. We can also see like open-ended straight draws. Okay, he probably is doing a lot of raising with like queen 10. So yeah, you can go and fine-tune it either by combo or by hand class. Or you can scroll through this list, for example, and like sort by, let's say, highest equity to lowest equity and node lock that way. So there's a lot of different like ways you can approach node locking. But either way, this is the strategy I've landed upon. And it's not a super precise art, right? Like node locking is a pretty subjective thing. It's all about like how you perceive these players and like what your assumptions are. Think of it less like data science and more like Bob Ross painting his range. You know, let's node lock this turn and or let's node lock this flop and take a turn card. Okay, so here again, under the gun hit overbet, but here we can see that they're just checking everything, and it's for the same reason that it was before. If you take a look up here, when it comes to the EVs or the equities, you can see that under the gun is actually behind both players in terms of raw equity and in terms of EV and in terms of equity realization. So by any possible metric, under the gun's range is way behind, and ace-jack is not a particularly happy hand. Ace-jack is ahead, but it's not like, it's not thrilled. And an overbet is frankly just the wrong size. The reasons haven't changed. As before, under the gun's main advantage was the fact that they have overpairs, whereas the other players did not. But now these overpairs have been demoted because all of the top pairs that hijack and button have called with have now been promoted to trips. And for this reason, under the gun should just check. But in game, they actually bet. And so again, we can do what we did before. I'm going to go on range frequency, and we're just going to force them to bet half the time. All right, that seems reasonable. Actually, Rampage said in game that his read was that under the gun might be doing this with kings or queens, which feels pretty loose, to be honest. Like overbetting into this feels kind of wild to me, but hey, you know what? Whatever. We're going to make him do it. Aces, kings, and queens are coming along for the ride. Now, in this spot, we can see that they're folding 9-8 in theory, which, yeah, obviously. Like when you call it on the flop, okay, maybe it makes sense because probably button folds behind. If you call, maybe your hand can improve. Maybe under the gun's bluffing, but like after button calls and under the gun then fires an overbet, your 9-8 is just garbage. Now, I'm assuming that either hijack is like a massive calling station, or they had a read that this specific sizing from under the gun was suspicious. So, anyway, regardless, they're going to be calling wider, right? So we're going to go down to range frequency, and I'm going to just go ahead and pump this up to, let's say, 35%, give or take. And we're also going to force them to call with 9-8. And presumably, if they're calling with 9-8, they're calling with 10-9. They're calling with queen 9, king 9, ace 9. In fact, what we can do is we can go over to hand classes, or better yet, combos. We can find 9-8. And we're going to say, like, all of these hands, you know, if they're not folding with 9-8, then they're probably not going to fold an open-ender either, right? And they're probably not folding with any of these either. So just have them call way wider. And I'm going to go ahead and apply this. Okay. And at this point, Rampage is like getting the feeling like, oh, what if my king jack's actually not good here? I'm getting kind of worried. There's a lot of money flying into the pot, blah, blah, blah. And he's right to get that feeling. But now that we've made the assumption that A, under the gun is betting like way more aggressively than they are in GTO, and B, hijack is cold calling with hands like as wide as 9-8. I mean, look, Rampage didn't really have this information at the time of making his decision, but regardless, as a post-mortem, we can say that given that we know under the gun is too wide and hijack is too wide, now king jack is a perfectly fine call. We can see it's very slightly ahead at this point, but not that far ahead. So they'll call, and we'll take a river. Okay, under the gun bets. And at this point, we have to make a decision. Like, do we really think that they are betting this big with like aces, kings, and queens? I think that's very hopeful. I think they're almost certainly doing it with boats. Like if they're doing it with ace-jack, they're probably doing it with 9s and 3s. Again, jacks is a pretty natural slow play. So we can go ahead and tweak this manually. So this time I'm going to do it a little bit differently. I'm going to switch over to hand frequency, and I'm going to make it so that 3s, 9s, ace jack, king jack. In fact, I'm just going to go hand classes. Trips. We're going to make trips always bet like this. And I'm going to turn this lock off. And what this does is it says, okay, these hands that I've selected must bet. But the rest of the range can do whatever it wants. You can decide what you want to do with the rest of these. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and apply this. And so this is called combo locking. So I'm not telling every hand what to do. I'm only telling trips plus what to do. Okay, and you can see that some of their hands are coming along for the ride. Like kings has decided to come along for the ride. A little bit of jacks, a little bit of jack 9. Yeah, so anyway, they bet here. I think this is like maybe a fair representation. But at this point, under the gun is just so value heavy that hijack just folds everything. Surprisingly, 9-8 actually does find the bluff shove, though. And I guess part of the reason for that is that it kind of like unblocks the folds that you're trying to get from button and under the gun. But at the same time, because you have the 9, you block one of the boats. So I guess, sure, 9-8 shoves. And okay, here, like, clearly you should probably still fold ace jack, right? And if you do call, like, again, you're just way behind at this point. You're not in good shape. Okay, so this, again, this is unrealistic. There's no way that, like, under the gun is not folding 9s here. If they tank folded ace jack, they're snap calling 9s, right? They're not folding 3s. So let's make some more assumptions here. I'm going to go back and node lock again. Select hand frequency. I'm going to paint over the strategy. So let's say that they always bet kings, queens, aces. Yeah, something like this. This is pretty value heavy, but I think it's appropriate. We're going to go ahead and lock everything this time. No, I think technically queens through aces is a bluff at this point, but I'm not sure if this player would know it. And now we see overcalls with like these hands here, which kind of makes sense. Like it feels like a spot where maybe you like call with trips and raise with a boat. But okay, they shove. And again, 9-8 is in there as a bluff. And here, surprisingly, now that we know that under the gun is like barreling with queens through aces, king jack is like a debatable call, and ace jack is mixed. So if you keep making the right assumptions, you can justify all 3 of these plays, right? You can justify, okay, let's say that under the gun is betting with these overpairs and they're betting with ace jack. Okay. Hijack's like, well, if that's the case, then maybe I want to shove like my boats and some good blocker hands, and 9-8 has good blockers. So if I arrive here with this hand, I might as well shove it sometimes as a bluff. And button's like, well, my hand's got good blockers. It's maybe like a very close decision, so I guess I'll call. And under the gun's like, well, the hand's kind of a close decision, but I guess I'll fold. Okay, so you can see that you can plug in whatever assumptions you want, and all of a sudden, different plays become more playable or less playable. And in practice, that's what poker is. It's just a series of Bayesian updates that, every time your opponents take some action, you update your beliefs about what they're representing. And so we can plug in different assumptions for what actions mean what cards and come out with different strategies. And I think the new node locking tool is a really nice way to do that. I hope you guys enjoyed this exploitative analysis. Anyway, guys, that's my video. I really enjoyed this one. I think this was just a wild hand by Rampage. Really fun to watch, really fun to analyze. I think multi-way spots are the next great frontier of unexplored poker theory. There's just so much we don't know. There's so much work to be done in this area, and I think that it's like a really good opportunity to get ahead of the regs. In general, like, multi-way spots happen way more than we like to admit that they happen in real life. So if you can be really sharp in those areas, you can make a lot of money. I also think that the new frequency locking is a great tool to model real strategies and exploits. Before, how we did it was we'd just move hands that have like the lowest regret, but that's a pretty exploitable way to do it. The new way is much more optimal when it comes to modeling some specific action, like forcing it to bet some certain amount of the time. But at the same time, like if you don't like the range it comes up with, you can still go and tweak it manually. Anyway, if you guys want to learn more about this, there's a link in the description to the official patch notes where you can learn more about Multiway, about the other updates we've put in. I'll also mention we added 50,000 final table solves, so this was a pretty big update overall. If you're an MTT player, that's a nice add-on. We also have a free flop that you can try, so if you want to mess around with multi-way solving, you want to try out the new load locking without paying any money, you can do that. Alright guys, thanks for watching my video, and happy grinding.